Right, we're going to reconvene the Renewable Energy Standard Working Group. And I think put it to the group. Is that what you were suggesting?
There's two details to tend to. And then the first is, Shauna, when we called on you last, there was some technical difficulty that kept you from adding a thought to that initial conversation. Let's make room for that now.
Thank you, Jen. Can you hear me now?
I can't hear you very well. Is our sound on in the room?
It is, but
Yeah. You're very distant. We'll listen carefully and see what we can catch.
I will try to be very loud. And I just wanted to make a note that from the bulk electric perspective, Belco's charge is to ensure that the grid can serve the highest electric demand in a way that complies with federal standards and regulations. And there has been some comments here about greater diversity in resources and reliability, which we are very much in agreement with. But I also wanted to add the point that our regional ties with our neighbors in the region serve a critical role in how Belco delivers safe, reliable, and affordable bulk electric power to Vermonters. I know that the renewable energy standard is more suited to the distribution utilities, but our two systems do connect and overlap. So I just wanted to draw that point. Secondly, just on the aspect of siting, and this comment is somewhat two-pronged in citing for reliability and then citing for equity. Improved siting of generation in terms of the actual location of distributed generation, that's an important piece in terms of transmission and grid planning. And I'll pose the question, bringing the reliability and equity to the forefront there. If there's alignment with equity interests and grid stability, resilient grid outcomes, and could a siting policy actually serve those two needs as we look at the renewable energy standard? And I'll stop there. Thank you.
So I'm going to, Shauna, it was really hard to hear you. I'm going to think this on this last piece that you were saying. I think it was about a relationship between resilience and reliability and equity. And then there's another point that you made before then around your regional ties, I think, with partners in the region. And if you have a takeaway there that you can put into the chat, that's going to be an easier way probably for us to catch it.
I will. I apologize. I'm going to keep working on this technical.
I think we're all doing the best we can in a hybrid environment to get as many voices into the mix. So I'm going to take a minute to jot this down. Relationship between equity, reliability, resilience. Here's the question that we're going to pitch to the group and speaking with the co-chairs about how to work with this list and what makes sense going forward. It makes perfect sense at this point to look at this list of many things and be seeing things that you both agree with and disagree with, that you would reframe, that you would reposition. That's actually the work that you're here to do. So looking at a list of 15 different items or more, it makes that pretty tricky. Ideally, we'd be able to simmer it down a little bit into some buckets that hold those tensions. Smaller list, easier than to chunk down and take on a conversation. The tension here is that you have folks who are willing to respond to the homework and some of the questions you raised at the last meeting, and they're slated for the same time spot. So, two proposals. One is that the co-chairs work with, and the legislative team works on this list and tries to distill it into those buckets and tensions based on what they know from you and based on what you've said in this list. And we bring it back to the group to start working on them. The second is to pick this conversation up again later in the agenda when you would have been talking about barriers to task 2, barriers to reaching 100% by 2030. I think they're both good options. And so I think the question here is if there's a consideration one way or the other that you'd want people to, that would lean you into one direction or another.
no one has a thought, opinion, burning desire.
Well, there's a lot to think about here too. And I do want to make sure I would like you to use your time to really maximize it. And this is where the heart of it is in the the topics listed on this sheet. You probably are a little worried about entering into a conversation that you can't finish because it's going to be complicated and go in lots of different directions. And you might also be sitting on questions that you have from contractors and want to make sure you get them asked.
I'm wondering if the legislators, whatever, take it as a homework task to try to bucket those up. And if maybe members of the committee, if you feel like you've been listening, you've all been part of the same conversation. If you have suggestions on how you would do that, you can send them to Chair Sheldon and I, and that could help us as we do that work. But I'm thinking of this as a service that we can provide because it's very hard to look at 21 separate items and have a discussion about that.
So it might
version works.
Might streamline that just a little bit, just so that there's so that you have some timelines around it. Our very immediate next step is going to be bucketing this up and getting it to you within as quickly as we can with a summary note. You can look at those buckets and then let us know what might be missing from the way that they've been reorganized, or if there's any massive oversights in the way they're reorganized. It clarifies it a little bit in that you get to see the raw data that's on this Google sheet, and you get to see how a small group of people have organized it into buckets, see if it provides you the framework that you need to have these conversations. Helpful?
Sure.
And Bill Driscoll has his hand up.
Go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah, just to clarify, so the expectation that this this list from earlier today is going to sort of be cleaned up and then sent out for feedback or flagging issues for conversation, or are we going to do any of that today?
I don't know if you're going to have time to do that today. So your first piece sums it up well.
Okay.
Co-chair's legislative team will go through and create a small list of buckets and send it to you all for review, with at least a week to work with it, if not longer, before your next meeting. Feedback would be welcomed at that point, for sure. Okay, I'm preparing then to pivot to the next agenda item as scheduled on the agenda, if you're ready for that.
All right.
I'll make a transition comment. Thank you, everyone, for weighing in. It's always good when everyone speaks. I don't need.
So here's where we are. The question and answer regarding the scenario and modeling data. You had some homework, working group members, between this meeting, the last meeting and this one, to raise any concerns or omissions that you noticed with the scenarios that were at that point coming out of the Department of Public Service. So you have Department of Public Service staff available to answer questions. Rattle Group may also give you an update on where they are with modeling. Co-chairs, would you like to share a summary of what you heard from folks? Themes, highlights?
I think, we have Mr. Poor with us, TJ's here, so I thought, given that he's been developing scenarios, they were in part what was precipitating all the conversation, that we might as well invite him to talk with us about scenarios and the feedback that he's heard through this committee as well as the process.
So TJ Poor, Director of Regulated Utility Planning. Yes, we've got that right this time at the Department of Public Service. The floor is yours, and if you'd like me to share slides, I think I at least have a PDF version that I can pull up.
Yeah, that would be great if, so I thought I would just do a really brief walkthrough of the slides that showed the scenarios. It's just really a couple of slides. And what we've called in the past final scenarios that we're modeling, that our stakeholder advisory group has contributed to the development of and decided on two final ones. But I just want to point out that final might not actually be the right term, because I kind of really see this as kind of the start of the work. And so we're bounding the possible futures here and kind of understanding what things might look like. And then we can take that and go into more detail and have real discussions on program design and other aspects. I'll circle back to that at the end, but I just wanted to kind of start with that I think this really is a really good starting place. So if you scroll down to the next slide, the scenarios themselves, we've been working on just developing these scenarios since the beginning of August. That's framing the scenarios with the stakeholder advisory group, where you can see the structure of that group, how it's selected, the members are linked there, and really getting input on what's important to model for all the scenarios. The notes on the scenarios, I think I'll talk about them on the scenario page because I think it'll make more sense. So if we go to the next slide. So these are the initial 4 scenarios that, they say PSD scenarios on the title slide here. This is what was included in the scope of work of the request for proposals that we put out. That scope of work was shared with and commented on by utilities, some regional planning commissions, and Renewable Energy Vermont and the coalition of stakeholders. We did provide written responses to all of those comments and incorporated a lot of them. And where we didn't, there was justification on why they were not included. So a couple of things just quickly on how to read this chart, because it took some time for the stakeholder advisory group, and we'll make sure everybody has it here as they look at it. Tier 1 is really the net of tier 2 and any regional tier. So what I mean by that is all of these scenarios add up to 100%, either 100% renewable or 100% clean in the case of scenarios 3 and 4 on this slide. And what that largely means is there's an addition of nuclear in those other tiers, but depending on how you might want to define imports of large hydro, that could also fall in there. The 100% targets are actually for 2030, but it says 2035 on here. But what happens in these scenarios is we reach 100% in the overarching tier by 2030, and then kind of back off that tier 1 with continued increases in tier 2 or the regional tier if it's applicable. So that kind of that's the structure of how this is set up. And scenario 2, I should say, just really aligns here intentionally, and we worked with Rev to make sure we got it right, I think. That it aligns with the proposal that Rev made in the legislature last year, or that was made in the legislature last year, so that we could see what the impacts of that are. The 2 other things here, scenarios 3 and 4, the clean energy scenarios, those still assume that the total renewable energy in the baseline doesn't change. So we still have a tier 1, 75% by 2032. The clean energy tier is 100% clean. And so we still have that kind of underlying renewability. And I just want to be clear on all these things, so we're speaking the same language. The last thing on this slide I will note is the eligibility date. You can see 2010 in here. There was a lot of discussion in this in the stakeholder advisory group. This is 2010 is really, after 2010 is really when some of the projects associated with the SPEED program, the precursor to the Renewable Energy Standard, and it's like kind of the first effort to cite local renewable generation in Vermont on a large scale was, even though we all know that the renewable energy credits were sent out of state, but really the eligibility date to include those projects to, it's been termed by some as kind of rehoming those projects. So that generation that was caused by policy in Vermont in that time frame would then be eligible for that regional tier in this analysis. The last thing I'll say on this slide is I'll go back to the scenarios 3 and 4 and say why are we including nuclear in here? And I think this is a discussion point. I think there's been some feedback on this, and we haven't recently, kind of fully responded to that. And so first, I'll just say, I'm just going to read part of the climate action plan here really quickly. It's strategy 1, pathway 1 in the electric sector. It says Vermont should develop 100% carbon-free or renewable electric portfolio standard to ensure progress continues into the 2030s and beyond, while being mindful of the economic impact on cost-burdened Vermonters and maintaining the cost effectiveness of fuel switching to electric measures. Normally, when I talk, I lead with the comprehensive energy plan, where of course, that plan, which is my favorite 400-page document ever, is consistent with that and also calls for consideration of both carbon-free and 100% renewable energy standard. Both of those processes, the energy plan and the climate action plan, had a lot of stakeholder engagement, had a lot of discussion on those issues in the electric sector, and we wanted to analyze that here to be true to what those documents say. Okay, so next slide is, so our scope of work called for the stakeholder advisory group to examine 2 additional scenarios as determined by the stakeholder advisory group. And so after a whole lot of discussion by the group, since the last time you all met, the group decided on options 1 and 4 here. Option 1, the main difference here is it removes biomass eligibility. This was not like a consensus, I would say, eligibility question here, but it's kind of a recognition that I think that this biomass is an issue that is being talked about pretty regularly, and we want to see what the impact is of a policy decision. It does not mean that that's going to be the answer, but we're going to look at what happens there. Option 4 has 2 additional things. It removes biomass and it adds nuclear. It also combines tier 2 with a regional tier. And so what that means is that there's not necessarily a requirement for local, that tier 2, the local generation must be sited in Vermont, but it does have a new requirement for anywhere in the region, including in Vermont. And you can see that tier is 60%. So it's a combined tier and it's higher. Some of the sensitivities I didn't mention on the previous slide, but those target percentages have sensitivities 10, 20, 30%, similar for both tier 2 and the regional tier. And I think on this slide, there's some considerations of how hydro would be treated. And so that would be including kind of low impact hydro, which is kind of certified hydro that is basically run a river using some Connecticut definitions as a proxy for what might happen in Vermont. That would be included. And then there's been kind of a, in the past, the debate about imported hydro from Canada. Essentially, it's not like a prohibition on that, but it's limited by percent of overall sales by kind of the how much can be actually met by tier 1. So there's some natural limitations in the scenarios of what might be used from imported hydro. That's a pretty fast rundown of those slides. I think now is probably a pretty good time to talk about how load flexibility and with storage as one tool is treated in the analysis. So the study will be able to answer the question of how much load flexibility with storage as one tool in the load flexibility bucket might be necessary to smooth generation load profiles relative to an hourly load. So it will include each of the scenarios. We can say this is how much storage or load flexibility might be necessary in order to avoid constraints or, well, I'll just say avoid constraints. The question that isn't answered, which was asked for, was kind of given varying levels of storage penetration going forward, what are the additional costs to integrate DG, distributed generation? And so one of the reasons that it's a challenge to do that in the time and resources that we have, it's a fair question and a good one, but it really requires an additional understanding of how the storage would be used and kind of the impacts to the storage unit or load flexibility. What load flexibility would be used? Are we talking about curtailment and what does that cost? Are we talking about moving load around, or are we talking about actually battery storage? And then what does that mean to other benefit streams? And so the use case for storage right now is really based on avoiding other costs, right? You're avoiding charges that a utility might otherwise incur for capacity charges. There's some regional transmission charges, and there's some kind of energy arbitrage in there. Well, that use case kind of changes if you're using storage primarily to smooth generation. And we don't have that answer right now exactly, like what the difference in costs and what the difference in the economics of a storage project is. So it's, these actions aren't free, they're, so we can't just say, hey, if we had X amount of storage on the system that was aimed at reducing, power supply charges, that we could just count that as being available to smooth generation. And that question, there's probably some percentage of it that would count, but that question is a really tricky one to answer. And right now, outside the scope of the project. Again, not saying that it's not a worthy question, but just to circle back, I think, the starting point for that conversation is, hey, we have these scenarios, we have constraints. How much load flexibility would be necessary in order to smooth this generation out? And the study will answer that question. Just because it was brought up earlier, I'll just note that we will be evaluating the impacts of all of these scenarios using both to ratepayers and using the social cost of carbon. I think that's something that we've at the department put in practice for years now, and try to do as often as possible. And that emissions savings will be kind of counted on a regional basis. So what I mean by that is it's anytime there's a new renewable energy generation project that is cited as a result of the scenario, then that will show emissions benefits by avoiding what's assumed to be the marginal unit on the system. Something like if a plant is existing right now, it's like 99% sure that will not be given emissions benefits, like by keeping it in place. That I only say 99% because if it could be proven that a plant was going to go offline and that Vermont's renewable energy standard, clean energy standard is going to keep that on, then we may consider that none of that information has been provided. So right now it's not going to be included. So existing plants that stay online, like if we purchase more nuclear from an existing plant that doesn't have real emissions benefits in the region, unless it can be proven that that plant was going to shut down. So, okay. So next slide, and then I'll be done. Most of this actually is just for posterity so that people can have it to refer to. I really just, I said at the beginning that this is really just the start of the process, and found the range of results. We talked, I think net metering was mentioned earlier. Yeah, and that is really within, and we see that and like a standard offer program is programs designed within the broad structure of a renewable or clean energy standard. And that design will absolutely affect the results of these scenarios. So we're hopeful that these scenarios will come up with a value and we'll say, hey, well, we're going to change program design parameter X, and that is going to reduce the cost from this scenario by a certain amount. That would happen afterwards. You all may be able to come up with what those costs are and then just kind of layer it on to the analysis. One of the reasons we didn't do that in this study was really just how this process generally works, right? We end up having a lot of negotiation on the finer points and fine details, and there are 1,000 assumptions that we could change and we could model. We're hoping that our analysis creates the kind of foundation where we're all speaking the same language and talking, and we can build off of that to say, okay, well, now what if we pull this lever and you all say, we change net metering and we estimate that reduced costs by 1%. And we can take that and say, okay, we'll put that stream of values into our analysis, and here's what the model spits out. And so I'll stop there. I went through a ton of stuff, but I did want to spit it all out. So thank you for letting me do that. And I guess open for questions.
The floor is open for questions. We have one online. William?
Thanks, and thanks, TJ. Sort of maybe just recapping, clarifying, and or asking questions. So if I understand you correctly, the missing cost factor, the notable missing cost factor that you were going over was storage. This question, is there any other missing factor of note? Is the storage cost factor only missing from the new scenarios or all the scenarios? And then finally, do you have any sense as to whether you will be able to develop some reasonable guess or range to consider for what those costs might be?
Yeah, so I guess I want to back up and say that one of the load forecasts and load profiles that we use is based on a regional study called the Avoided Energy Supply Cost Study. And we're using what they call the all-in climate policy sensitivity. And so what that does is assume that the region is going to do what it takes to meet its climate policies. That policy does include an assumption for load flexibility in it. But again, it is all based on kind of moving load around. As part of these initial scenarios, we don't expect to kind of evaluate the use case of storage for avoiding power supply costs versus avoiding a transmission constraint. It's kind of a chicken or the egg. Instead, we're taking the current known constraints and saying, here's where they are with a certain amount of distributed generation, and here is how much load flexibility will be needed. And then that kind of turns into an opportunity. And we, right now I can't commit. I don't know that we have resources to do like another multi-$100,000 study, by the spring, but it gives us the opportunity to say, okay, we need this much, and then we can start to talk about how much of that might be might happen through storage that is happening on the system in Vermont already, how much of it might be that isn't already kind of assumed in the load profile of in the load shape that we're analyzing, and then what that might cost. And that's a broad conversation. There are like some big questions there, and I don't know that we're going to have the answer. I mean, if you're using the same storage facility for multiple things, are you cycling it more? Does that reduce the lifetime of the battery? There's all kinds of different questions that I don't have an answer to as we sit here today. And we want to get as far as we can, but I don't have a good answer for you, Bill. Sorry.
Okay, thanks.
So time is short and you have comments queuing up. So I'll take them in order. I see online hands first. How many people in the room are saying a comment? Okay, so let's go with online and then we'll come back to the room. Ben, go ahead.
Thanks. So 2 questions, and both of these are really in the sort of clarifying category. One, I believe last week you said that the Inflation Reduction Act tax credits would be incorporated into the modeling. I just wanted to ask, one, sort of first order, does that include all of them, including, domestic production? And then 2, is it, are you going to be able to model other effects of the Inflation Reduction Act that are not on the direct developer, increased domestic production and the tax credits down or upstream there, potential, increases or decreases in the cost to deploy because of more deployment in the country as a whole. So that sort of as a broad question, like how much of the IRA are you going to really be able to include in the modeling? And then the other question, which is, speaks to sort of what you were just talking about around storage, for load flexibility, same basic question. I think we all assume that we'll be doing a lot more in the future to move energy use to when energy production is happening. To what degree is the model able to incorporate that?
So one, yes, the tax credits will be incorporated through the production cost estimates that our consultant is making. And the load flexibility, I guess I'm not sure how to answer that any more than I already have, in that we're going to see how much load flexibility is needed. And then we're not going to be able to kind of shift the load profile to do lots of sensitivities on the load profile. And the reason is because the load profile is tied to hourly estimates of energy costs. And so if you shift the load profile, then that changes what the future energy costs are. And those things really, it's important to keep those linked in the analysis. And so that maybe gets like 10% of the way there to your second question, but that's what I got.
Okay, I appreciate it. And just, I apologize for asking a follow-up, but I think I'm hearing yes, but I just want to be totally clear on the point. On the IRA, I don't just mean the direct tax credits that are available to the developer, but the other effects of the law more broadly will be incorporated to a significant degree in the modeling. That's right?
That is my understanding. That's why we hired Sustainable Energy Advantage with their expertise on the renewable energy production costs expected.
Great. Thanks so much.
Chase.
Thanks. So I was wondering on the sensitivities that I saw referenced in, I think it was your last slide, TJ. Do you have a list of what those sensitivities are, just to sort of get a better sense of what sort of cost assumptions and trade-offs you're considering?
So
if there is such a list, a document, could you share that, please?
Yeah, I'll share the slides from our last meeting. Ultimately, we're going to be able to present a certain amount of case runs, but a lot of like specific inputs, like a dollar value impact, like social cost of carbon, for example, we'll use the Climate Council's number. But if somebody wanted to use a different number with a different discount rate, what have you, you could plug that in and the model should, spit out different results. And so So there's kind of a difference between the list as I'll share the slide presentation on the assumptions. But then there's other things. Basically anything that's a number value, and this is after the report because we can only kind of really present on a certain amount. But anything that has a number value can be changed in the model, and the model should be a working model, and we hope to be able to use it going forward. I'm going to caveat that by saying the department, after this is done, can't just be pulling the lever for an infinite amount of combinations. And so, we'll make the model available as well, and hopefully help people use it if they want to.
Yeah, thanks, TJ. I guess if the slide you shared last week is a comprehensive list of all of the sort of cost sensitivities that you are taking into account, you don't need to reshare that. Of course, we have a copy, but if it's not comprehensive, if there are other sort of cost sensitivities that are being considered, it would just be great to learn what those are. But we can talk about that further. I'd love to know basically what the total list of sensitivities is at some point. Thank you.
Darren and then Brian.
Thank you. And thanks, TJ, for that presentation. I have a few questions that kind of all relate to the sensitivities around biomass. And I'll share them in order and glad to hear any thoughts. I'm curious, just to the extent that you're modeling that, are you able to look in the modeling at the impact on individual utilities of that sensitivity? Are we able to distinguish in any way kind of on, biomass is a big topic. It's done in different ways in different places. Do we distinguish based on sort of carbon profile of individual fuel resources? Are we able to model the replacement cost, particularly in the wintertime? And are we able to model the economic impacts for Vermont of potentially relying on an external resource as opposed to an in-state resource? Those were some thoughts I had relative to the biomass sensitivities. I realize you may not be able to capture all of those, but I wanted to at least flag them as thoughts.
So economic impacts is yes. Replacement costs are kind of part of the economic impacts, I think. So that's a yes. The carbon impacts, I think, would be modeled. And you had one more, and I lost it.
I
got it. Sorry, the difference between utilities. So the model itself won't be utility specific, but I think after the model, there's going to be a cost difference with and without biomass. 75% biomass in the state is owned by or encompassed within McNeil, right? And so we know the ownership shares of McNeil, and you could kind of allocate the cost that way, I think. And then allocate Rygate across the state similarly. But so I think you could do it that way, but it's not kind of part of the core model.
Got it. Thank you. And just with the replacement cost, just a slight further kind of granular detail is for us, if we were to look at something like that, it wouldn't just be the rec replacement cost or the energy replacement cost, but it would be the dispatch model for that plant. The fact that it runs during summer peak primarily, and how that impacts, what type of battery storage, for example, would you need to replace that type of dispatch model, not just energy. So that's what I was thinking about.
Okay. So it's not our model won't be a dispatch model, but as I understand it, we will have a profile of biomass plants in general. I'm not sure if McNeil's specific profile is in there or not. I can check on that. But and yes, then that profile would need to be replaced. And so I think that answers it.
Brian, this will be the last comment before we need to transition.
Thank you. Many of my questions have already been addressed, so keeping it short. Not being present at the last meeting, taking a look at this statically as far as the handout, that my my level of understanding and discussion rose as a result of TJ's earlier presentation. But a number of the questions, including particularly the ones that Darren asked, were ones that popped into my head. But I'm just wondering if there is additional opportunity to catch up with you on other questions that I may have as a result of, trying to recognize dealing with storage and other aspects of, how that will play into this.
Absolutely. My virtual door is always open.
Thank you.
So in terms of next steps, so one is to be in touch with you if there are additional questions. Any other next steps you want this group to know around modeling or when the modeling will be available to you?
Yeah, so we're expecting draft results towards the end of the month, beginning of October. We have picked a time yesterday or the day before of a public workshop where we're going to actually share draft results publicly. I can send that to you all to share with the group. That's October 10th from 12 to 3. And then after that, our stakeholder advisory group will follow up. One of the goals of that is for that stakeholder advisory group to hear the comments that the general public is hearing or is saying, and to kind of we're just part of our broader engagement effort. Then, final results will be, several weeks after that. So still looking at end of October along our original timeline for that. So the other thing I will mention, and it's just been delayed because for resource reasons at our office, but we have done, as you all know, statewide polling and focus groups. We have a report that is going to be released soon. And we're hopeful that it's the end of this week or early next week, although I'm trying to learn not to make promises on some of that stuff. So we want to get that out. That's going to come out and has got a lot of interesting feedback. There's something in there for everybody, I think. And I can't wait to share it, honestly. I just need some time.
All right, so there are inroads to catch up and get more information as needed, and a couple of work products coming out as soon as a few weeks. Public workshop on October 10th. Final results at the end of October. So, yeah.
I'd like to just put two questions on the table and we can follow up later. I know we're out of time. And that was in terms of modeling. One, do you have, does the sensitivity analysis allow you to look at cost of demand side management versus storage so you can dial up one versus do that trade-off? And then the second one is, do you have any way to define the cost or value of RECs? Because those affect the choices of people either considering purchasing or generating.
So the short answer to the first one is going to be no, for the reasons I talked about the cost and the use cases of storage. The second question, I wrote down yes, but I actually don't. I'm blanking on what the question is. Sorry.
Classes of RECs and
yes.
Part of the discussion is, well, maybe there's a new class and maybe the economics that drive the decision making about either to generate or purchase could be influenced by those.
So yes, the answer is yes. SEA is really expert in the regional renewable marketplace, and things like a regional tier that, align with how other states look at high value renewable energy credits, and there will be a market price. The price of RECs might not be the actual cost of, new renewables, though, to be clear, because you could potentially purchase a plant or get the power from a plant at, the value of kind of the other products, right? Energy capacity, other benefits. We're going to see what that cost ultimately is, but there's the range, right? It could equal that or be even less than that, or it could be more. And that's what the RECs, theoretically, that's what the rec might be, even if it had greater value outside of the state.
So I don't know if other questions will come your way or not, but I do know Brattle Group is on the call for a couple of moments. I believe have an update for all of you around how their work is gaining traction. Brattle Group, is there an announcement you wanted to share at this point? We have a couple minutes before we go to a break. Are they still on the call or did they?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, Brattle is here. I'm sorry, the audio cut out for a moment. I didn't hear your.
Yeah, you know, my voice is not carrying very well, so I'll try to project it more. Do you have announcements or updates for this group around how your work is gaining traction before we go to a break?
Yes, we have a brief update. And we actually have a slide that kind of reminds people of the overall structure. But the most significant thing is last week we had a meeting together with the DPS and SEA, and basically did a handshake across the analytic handoff from SEA's analysis to our analysis. And we were very much encouraged that the way they are thinking of this and the way they are setting up their analysis fits very well with the inputs that we anticipate needing for our analysis. If we have the ability to share the screen, Wanjun, maybe you can put up a slide to remind the group here sort of the structure of our analysis, and we can talk through just a little bit of how that conversation last week came out, and I think was very encouraging that it looks like everybody's already thinking about this in the same way, and the analyses are going to feed very well from one end to the other.
Right. I don't think I have screen
You aren't able to
sharing.
show your screen.
Jennifer, I did also send you the slide via email.
Okay. We're going to get you permissions and I will look for it as well in case we need it as a backup. See if you can share now.
I can. Okay. All right. So yeah, as Dean mentioned, we had a productive meeting with SEA, mainly focused on understanding the benefit cost analysis. And for those of you who weren't at the meeting, who just joined now, SEA consultants are carrying out the benefit cost analysis, focusing on the direct costs and benefits to utilities and ratepayers in Vermont. And Brattle will be doing the economic impact assessment that translates these costs and benefits to economic activity, like employment and state GDP impacts. SEA and us, Brattle, are still working on tying down a few loose ends, but we agree that all the right things are being modeled for both the purposes of measuring economic efficiency via a benefit cost measure, but also for the purposes of using the benefit cost results as the impact source for the economic impact assessment portion of this project. So at a high level, SEA will provide the economic impact assessment model with two types of information. The first has to do with net spending, and this addresses how much investment is needed to procure renewable or clean resources, the grid integration cost involved. SEA here is in this step is planning on providing information on how the electricity generating resource mix both within and outside of Vermont evolves over time in each scenario. So we'll use that info to assess what needs to be built and what kind of economic activity is generated. But on top of the additional spending required to have more renewables on the grid, SEA also plans to quantify the avoided or deferred T&D costs that stem from having resources connected to the distribution system, reducing loading on the transmission system. So the net spending information provided will be used to assess how much economic activity is generated in Vermont and outside of Vermont that result in employment and state GDP impacts. Now, the second type of information is on bill or rate impacts. SEA again will provide impacts on bills based on REC costs that result from retiring more RECs and price suppression dynamics of having more renewable energy resources on energy and capacity prices. These price effects will be passed to the economic impact assessment model to assess how ratepayers make consumption decisions differently. So for households, depending on how much bills you have for electricity, you'll maybe change your consumption patterns for non-electricity goods. Same for producers, based on their budget. Maybe there are savings, maybe you spend more on electricity, but depending on that, you'll end up differently using your production inputs. And all of this, again, will have GDP impacts and employment impacts in Vermont. As this last box here, the output of this joint modeling framework, we hope to include state GDP, as mentioned, employment impacts, and welfare impacts by household income levels to see how the RES policy impacts different income groups. That's the update we have from the Brattle group.
Are there questions for the Brattle group from any working group members? Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Co-chairs, we're scheduled for a brief break.
Yeah, 5 minutes.
It will be brief, and here's what to expect for all of you. It will be a really brief break, so we'll start right at 5 minutes. There'll be a bit of time for us to do a bit of work. I do need your ear for a minute so we can figure out how to maximize that time. Public comment is still scheduled for 11:30. Next steps at 11:45. So reconvene.